Can't help but wonder where I'm bound, where I'm bound. Can't help but wonder where I'm bound.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's the Rush? I'm Rebecca Rusch, and this is a journey of transformation and excavation. Just as Michelangelo chiseled away everything that wasn't David to reveal the masterpiece within, we explore what can be shed or left behind. And with our guests, and also with you, we talk with some of the world's most renowned humans to ponder their wisdom and insights that emerge not from the spotlight, but in their moments of darkness, stillness, reflection. And the ultimate goal here for us is to evolve and move forward to whoever it is we dream of being. And I truly believe that this kind of discussion and exploration helps us as individuals, but also helps humanity as a whole. So grab a chisel. We're going to dive in. The perfect person for this type of journey is a fellow adventurer and explorer, Cory Richards. Welcome to What's the Rush today.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been a minute in the making, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, luckily we're endurance athletes, so we made this happen. I want to first give us a launching point, a little bit of background on you for everyone listening, and then we can get right into it. You can tell me if I missed anything, and we'll get into the discussion. So
I promise.
Okay. All right, everyone. Cory Richards is someone who's not only stood at the highest peaks in the world, Everest twice, Without O2 once, and many other places that most of us will never, ever go. But he's also journeyed into the deepest valleys of the human spirit, perhaps another zone that many of us fear to tread, but we're going to go there anyway. He's internationally acclaimed as a photographer, writer, artist, storyteller, and elite athlete whose work has graced the pages and stages everywhere. And he really captivates us with his raw visuals of the planet, but also the intricate stories of its inhabitants. His professional career began with high-risk climbing expeditions paired with photography, and in 2011, he made history as the first American to summit an 8,000-meter peak in winter. And that journey was marked by an avalanche that nearly claimed his life, became an award-winning film, and landed him on the cover of National Geographic's 125th anniversary issue. It was a personal photo he took of himself moments after surviving the avalanche, and I believe it was a massive launch point for him. But behind the accolades and images is an amazing guy who has faced immense personal challenge, from a chaotic youth, a bipolar diagnosis at 14, being institutionalized, sometimes homeless, struggling with family challenges, addiction, and navigating the confusing terrain of high achievement and mental health. His advocacy, and his honesty. Through that, Cory has really opened a gateway. And his current book, The Color of Everything, The Journey to Quiet the Chaos Within, is a deep and personal memoir, but in it are pieces of all of us, a reflection of the human condition. And the book is really an invitation to explore our own narratives and find compassion for ourselves and for others. Cory, I am so happy to connect with you today. We talked beforehand. I have been reading your book over and over again and going back to it. And it really is a gift and an invitation. And not only is it your story, but it's our story. So that's a great launch point. Did I miss anything that you feel is really relevant to get the readers up to speed?
No, you didn't miss a thing at all. I'm trying to manage any sounds that you hear in the background right now. Is it too loud? I mean, geez, is it? Are we going to make it through?
It's totally awesm, and
Good.
Yeah, this is an imperfect exploration. So we're going to go where we want to go, and I invite you also as an invitation to steer the conversation if it feels natural.
I love that. I love that. No, you didn't miss anything. Thank you again for having me. It's such, I love these conversations that are so much more thoughtful and curious about. I think it's really easy in this world to get wrapped up in the, in sort of like the look what I did world of all these things.
Yeah.
And so to have the conversations that take us a little bit more internal, I think is so special. So thanks for that opportunity.
Well, and we share, you're welcome. And, this podcast is launched from some of my reflections, some of my personal traumas and challenges. This is the result of that kind of exploration. Whereas your book is also the result of a lot of internal and external work that you've done. So I think you're the perfect person to be here. We share an adventurous lifestyle, but also the desire to journey within. So I know this hour is going to go by really quickly. I want to start a little bit with some definitions and some clarifications from you in the mental health space, because I think that the language around how we speak about some of this is super important. So I want to ask you a couple things. You have a diagnosis of bipolar. Can you explain
Mhm.
that?
Yeah. So, look, the way we understand bipolar now is it is very sort of spectrum. It's gone from manic depression, which was one thing, to bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, which are more clearly delineated. But now we realize also that people exist all over the spectrum, and oftentimes there's overlapping sort of behavior patterns that come with like ADHD. All that to say that the diagnosis that I got when I was, and I want to be also very clear here that I'm not a clinician. I'm somebody who studied this extensively, but I don't speak as a psychologist or as a therapist. I speak from somebody who's gone really, really deep, not only into my own mind, but into the world that sort of is around this. And so this is the best of my understanding, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Is that so? Bipolar 2, it sits on the spectrum below bipolar 1. That doesn't mean it's any less serious. It just means that what I don't experience is mania, acute mania. And mania is characterized by almost, it can't even be a psychotic break, where there's sort of a losing touch with reality, a losing, it's a heightened expression of what I experience, which is called hypomania. Now, hypomania is actually a really lovely place to live if you can sustain it, but most of us can't. And what that is just like you're incredibly activated, enviably social. You can't accomplish anything. You have a reduced need for sleep. You have amplified energy, and your skills at activating are incredibly heightened. So you can accomplish literally limitless things. On the flip side of that, and usually what I experience, is a very, very crushing depression that can come with, suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, and at some points in my life, planning around that. And so that's really how it's characterized. What I've experienced more in my life is what are called mixed episodes, where those two experiences can overlap, and they can be very, very unsettling, and it can blur sort of consciousness in a way that is disruptive to really anything. So while you have this hyperactivation and sort of that can be characterized by very fast thinking, very fast thoughts, there's also this radical discomfort of almost, for lack of a better way of saying it, kind of wanting to die. And it can be so paralyzing, because not only are you paralyzed by the speed with which your mind is working, but also the almost paralysis that comes with the depression underneath. And so there's this profound tension that arises when I'm in those states that is debilitating at times.
And this is something that you're living with every day of your life, or this is ongoing, or I mean, you talk about you go way back into your childhood in the book, and it sounds like there were some of these markers or symptoms throughout your life, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, do I live with it every day? There are glimmers of it in my daily life.
Mm-hmm.
I can trace this back to my earliest experience of this sort of overlapping experience of the two things, to where I was 13 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that moment. I remember it so clearly. And I write about it in the book, being in my family den and just not being able to sleep, and watching my thoughts accelerate to this point of like, I don't know what's happening, and yet just wanting it to stop, and this deep sort of self-loathing. So do I experience it every day? I would say I navigate this world every day with these knowings and this experience and this sort of encoded knowledge. But is it something that I necessarily deal with on a day-to-day basis? No, I'm not necessarily confronting it on a day-to-day basis. Does that make
I
sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of, I'm glad you kind of mentioned this spectrum of, and there's a lot of conversation around mental health right now, which is great.
Yeah,
From athletes, from a lot of people. It's a little confusing because you think of, I mean, we think of our physical health and either, a little bit of duality of I'm healthy or I'm not,
right.
physically, mentally. And you mentioned the word spectrum, and there's been a little bit of often people will just sort of in passing say, oh well, they're on the spectrum, and meaning a far end of a mental health spectrum. But if it's a spectrum, aren't we
Then
all?
we're all on the
Yes.
spectrum. Yeah.
Yes. And that's what I kept seeing in your book is I have not been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. I've definitely gone through mental health crisis challenges, undiagnosed, but very recognizable in some of the things that you explain through your extensive therapy and your extensive personal research, that we aren't we all on the spectrum, and aren't we all dealing with mental health every day?
What's really it? I think we are first and foremost, yes, and I think it's also an issue of language. We're because we're so driven by storytelling, and language is sort of the bedrock of storytelling. We're always looking for ways to most effectively describe the experiences that we're having. So we and even like neurotypical and neurodivergent are they're better, but they're still approximations, because that sort of suggests that there is one typical way of operating and thinking. But if you dive into it, you realize that's just not the case. And especially if you read somebody like Gabor Mate's The Myth of Normal, you start to see, oh yeah, nothing really, this whole thing is so much broader. I mean, it's 8 billion minds broad, right? So I think the other thing that I really try to focus on is not attaching a story to a diagnosis.
Mhm.
And so often now we throw around diagnoses like they're candy. They're like, oh, I was dating a narcissist, or oh, whatever happened, or I'm ADHD, and we own these things, and we're very definitive and very declarative about them. And yet so often what I actually hear when I hear people describing those things is a way to understand their experience, right? And the diagnosis itself is really just a word that we put around a cluster of behaviors
Mhm.
that bleed into all sorts of other areas of our lives, right? And they're not so. What I mistook for so long about all this stuff was like, oh, I'm bipolar, which means I'm sick. And I don't really like the word the term mental illness. That to me feels, again, like there's this implication, because if all of this is somewhat spectrumy, then you just have more or less complicated clusters of behaviors that you're trying to work through,
Yeah.
right? But when we talk about a stigma is when is perpetuated when we lean into sickness. It's like, oh, I have a mental illness. And so we create a framework around that in our minds that is somehow based on wellness versus the simple statement of fact, this is how my mind tends to work. Even saying this is how my mind works, well, now you're in a box. You know what I mean? So I think being careful with the language we use, being careful with diagnoses, being careful with being mindful of how we're telling the story of our own struggles is super, super important. And the reason is that is really all about agency. Because if we give away the power to, well, I'm ADHD, ergo X, we've sort of just said, I don't have any control over it.
Mhm.
And I don't believe that.
Mhm.
So I believe that our minds are structured in certain ways. I believe that we can restructure our minds. For me, a better way to examine those things is, in these environments, I tend to,
Mhm.
which is more of a statement of fact versus I am this, ergo that, which are
Yeah.
these, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it makes me think about the identities of all of us. I'm an athlete, I'm a this, I'm a climber, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
photographer, I'm a concussion survivor. The
Mm-hmm.
last few years, I've been in the dark hiding out of
Mm-hmm.
shame because I didn't want to tell people I was having basically a health crisis,
Mm-hmm.
mentally and physically, emotionally, in a lot of ways. And yeah, and it was nice to say I had a concussion
Yeah.
because it is looked at as an injury, albeit an
Mm-hmm.
invisible injury. But that did turn into depression and a lot of other downstream effects because the injury wasn't treated appropriately. So
Right.
I like what you're saying about how I think definitions help define us sometimes, and they really hold us back sometimes. So, how
That
do you meet somebody where they are, but, you know, not label them?
it's so interesting. It's such a good question. First of all, how did the concussion happen?
Okay.
I mean, I knew you had an injury, but I didn't know the specifics.
It was a basic bike crash, not
Okay.
just cruising along and bounced on my head and
Bounced on my head.
yeah, landed on my
Love
head.
it.
It was a pretty serious crash, but
Yeah.
I self-evacuated. I was alone, not near cell phone coverage, got myself out and just sort of figured, okay, great, I survived. That was the worst of it. I'm good. But it really ended up being long. I had long-term symptoms because I didn't get good health care initially for the
Yeah.
brain injury. So yeah, and that led to a pretty dark period of a lot of the kind of exploration that you've done over your lifetime.
Well, it's funny because when I talk about resilience, when I'm talking to whether it's individuals or companies or whoever, one of the things that is often clear is that crisis is the point of growth,
Mhm.
right? And so we always try to avoid crisis, and yes, that's good. Like we don't want to always be living in crisis, but oftentimes too, when we experience something, whether it's an injury, a death, something traumatic, that often is the impetus, it's the catalyst that thrusts us into the place of deep introspection and curiosity. um I think to your question, one of the things that, how do you meet somebody where they're at? Well, you just, first and foremost, you just listen.
Mhm.
I've learned that there's a skill. It's a kind of therapy. It's called imago, IMAGO, and it's really sort of um a hybrid in some ways of active listening and nonviolent communication. But what it teaches you to do is take on what somebody else is saying without interjecting in any way, shape, or form, and just really, really listen. And if they're practiced at it, and if you are practiced at it, you can get right down to, well, what's the thing that this is actually scratching at in your deepest self, your deepest wound? And usually, I would say 9 out of 10 times that comes down to a core belief that something is there's a value deficit. I don't matter. I'm not enough. I'm not chosen. Um, and and so when we're listening to people, I've found that in my past I would often listen to respond versus listen to take on the information that they're offering, listen to um, hear really what they're experiencing, and from that point, it's less about, well, let me tell you why that's wrong, or let me tell you what I can do different. It's more about, I really can see you now as somebody who is experiencing this, and I can see um, that deeper question or wound or curiosity that's coming up for you. So for example, when you get a head injury, right? And all of a sudden you're having all of these, and I don't know exactly what your journey was, and I'd love to know more about that, but you're having all sort of, there's the incapacitation that then is confronting certain pieces of yourself that you might not have been looking at, right? Because you can't do the things you were doing, because now all of a sudden that activity it's extracted. So this thing that has anchored you so much is being pulled apart from you. And there's this big space in the middle. And you're going, well, what the fuck? If I can't do that, what am I? Where's my value? So then you're going back to this value question. Well, like, like, that's what I do. So if I don't do that, do I matter? And that's a relatable question that everybody can get on board with. Whereas if we're just listening to the specifics of things and then trying to be like, well, you know what I did for my concussion, we're actually not engaging with the person's experience. So that's one way where I really try to level set. And if I hear somebody saying, my ex was this, or this person is that, or I am this, really what I'm trying to hear is like, well, what's your experience around all of this? Because I don't really care about the label.
Yeah.
I'm not a psychologist.
Yeah. Do you, and it's pronounced imago, is that right?
Yeah, imago. And
Imago.
I think it comes from the Greek word image.
Can you practice, are you practice at imago on yourself, with yourself, listening to yourself non-judgmentally?
I mean, that's a beautiful question. And I think a skilled person absolutely could. That's sort of more similar to IFS work, which stands for internal family systems, where we're looking at the different parts of us. We have this idea that it's a mono mind, it's just one mind. But if we're really, at least I'll say for myself, when I've been really honest about it, there are many different pieces of my mind always talking, and many different versions of myself advocating for the things that they need or think they need. And so, yes, you could extend sort of imago concepts into sort of an IFS concept where you're listening to the different pieces of yourself non-judgmentally.
You have so kind of a depth of experience in formal therapy. I think you started at age 1.
I'm exhausted.
I mean, it's a wealth of education and learning. Absolutely. And you talked about a second ago how crisis leads to growth, and you live in LA. There are families and communities and individuals going through what will be generational trauma for a very long time, and you're right in the middle of it. You're pretty trauma versed.
Right.
How are you taking what you know from your traumatic experiences and education? How are you supporting the people in LA right now, and the friends and the communities there? And even strangers, everyone's living in a massive group trauma.
It's funny. It's such a good question. And I think it's actually, again, I think it's thrust me into a deeper evolution with myself, because first and foremost, I'll just say I do a lot of men's work here. So I have a men's group that I've been working with in different iterations, first as a part of and now co-facilitating for about 4 years. And within that community of our immediate group, 30 plus guys, nine people lost their homes. So that's 9 people that I'm in contact with, on a weekly basis. And that's probably less than a lot of people. People's whole lives operated in and around these communities, Altadena and the Palisades. And one of the things that I've really, it's really asked me to rethink what I believe resilience to be, and what it looks like in practice, and what are its components. And the other thing that it's asked me to do is question my beliefs about myself and the way I operate in the world. And by that, I mean, what I've seen in this past 2 months since this happened is I feel like they're rebuilding the entire Palisades right next to me right now. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but it's phenomenal on this end. But if you can't, let's do it. It's great.
No, you sound great.
It's I spent years and years and years and years being entirely self-focused. And oftentimes I would, you know, like sort of paint that through the lens of, well, I'm doing all these great things. I'm inspiring people. I'm contributing. I'm taking these photographs that are changing policy and all this stuff. But if I'm being very honest about it, it was completely self-indulgent. And I'm not saying it was bad. It was just, I was focused on myself. And since moving here and going through this experience, I did not lose my home. But my two best friends did. I've realized that my entire focus has shifted outward instead of being inward. And that's only come through the ability to care for myself in a more holistic way. But it's also helped me. So, I mean, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? It means helping people move. It means helping people move furniture in their new house that is completely unfamiliar. It means watching kids, taking kids to school. It means, just showing up and not trying to change the situation. Because again, that goes back to sort of the structure of resilience that I've really started to articulate. Um, and so it's it illuminated in me a different set of values that I don't think I had for a long time. I didn't know how to be outside of myself, and I didn't know how to be focused on others in a meaningful, generative way. So much of my life was about it was an extractive presence, and I don't say that trying to shit on myself. I don't at all. It's just that's the truth. I don't say it with any sort of self-loathing or blame. It's just what I was doing. And go ahead. Yeah.
It's a natural arc of
Yeah.
aging, of, in our younger years, we're the caterpillar consuming, doing stuff, creating stuff. And that at some point we shift from me to we,
Yeah.
it's, I'm not trying to minimize it and simplify it, because I'm also going through that shift as well. Much of my career was very much about how many wins, how many things, how many trophies and accolades and stuff,
Yeah.
are a great springboard to do something else with. So not mitigating that those are unimportant, or the work that you've done is not unimportant. It's important, but it's not everything. And I think that's a natural shift that, as we grow and learn, most people hopefully make.
I would hope so. There's a natural in all sorts of mysticism, Jewish mysticism, there's this age of 40 where you shift from like the doing into the embodiment, and then into the work of giving back. And it occurs throughout all sorts of different mythologies.
Yeah.
So there is, and I'm going to be 44 this year. And so that shift, I've watched that shift happen, and it's given me so much peace. And it's what I've seen is that when I'm focused outward, my capacity is actually much, much bigger. My allostatic load grows because I can actually, it's not this deep internal churning that's trying to sort something out inside of myself. It's like, no, that's level set. So how can then I take that energy that I've been focusing there and put it out into the world in a helpful, meaningful way? I think a lot of people get caught up in this, like, oh, I have to do everything. I have to be the savior. That's not what I'm talking about at all.
Well,
I've noticed that
simply showing up, for someone to take their kids to school, that's
yeah,
a pretty big deal. And it is simple, but it's showing up. And it is a savior probably for that mom and those parents.
In that moment, giving is such a powerful, it's sort of one of the pillars that I try to work into my day, is an act of giving. And it doesn't have to be extravagant. It doesn't have to be donating. It doesn't have to be volunteering. Giving, it can be so much simpler than that. And it can be as simple as just hiding a card in somebody's drawer that you love that they find later. That's a gift. Reminding them that they're God and you love them. It can be picking somebody up from school. It can be all of those things. It can be cooking dinner. But giving and becoming mindful of the moments in which you're choosing to actually give without any sense of martyrdom or design for return is God, what a fucking gift.
It is, but you have to be strong enough to in yourself. I remember in the hardest part of the concussion recovery, I called in to Michael Gervais and Rich Roll, where it had to like ask me anything, and I like called in, and because I was so tired of like dealing with myself, I was over
Mhm.
myself, and I
Yeah.
called in and said, "When does self care turn into like selfishness?"
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I was just so over myself, but I was still working through a lot and still pretty injured and not well. And their answer was kind of twofold, is that, turning to others and service is obviously an amazing thing to do, and it lifts people up, and it's demonstrated in depression and mental health care is to help other people. But on the flip side, Michael Gervais said, but you have to be strong enough first yourself to be able to sort of stand up and lend a hand out to someone else. You don't need to be 100%, but you can't be on the floor.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you have to see, I've also noticed this about myself is when I was actually trying to be of service in previous iterations of myself, um, oftentimes, you know, it was more of an attempt to fix or
Mm,
take pain away,
mm,
which in reflection, I can see very much that that was an attempt to take the pain away from me, right? So it
mm,
never really worked that well, or it got exploited. And so you're absolutely right that you have to have a strong foundation to begin to be of service. That doesn't mean that the acts of service aren't meaningful, but it's not sustainable if you yourself are not on solid footing.
right. You talked about sort of this, 40s and this kind of transformation, and you've obviously made a huge transformation in the last decade and a bit. Was there sort of a catalytic experience that kind of started this to internal introspection, and this outward adventure doing all this great stuff? Was there a moment or a thing that kind of tipped the scales?
Well, I mean, I think, I start the book with the avalanche.
Hmm.
And I think the avalanche it's in a,
And that was
that was
2011,
2011.
right?
But again, I was only 29 at the time. And so I would say it's not one experience. It's been a continuum of things that, were all the same message, but could only take on pieces of at a time.
Hmm.
So the avalanche being the one where it's like, oh wow, there's this whole internal world, this childhood that I understand conceptually that I need to now look at more completely. And so I really dove into the world of therapy and trauma and what does it look like, and I got really really sort of educated by all of it or on all of it. um but and I was absolutely at the capacity that I could be during those years trying to understand it and make sense of all of it. And I'll say this, it was, it took, gosh, from that year until about, I would say, 2 years ago, so 12 or 13 years for me to really start to what I would call embody um, all of the things that I was learning. And it wasn't just the avalanche, it was, and I talk about all of it in the book. It was um, having this very big career, getting divorced, going through, a very sort of a problem drinking spell, being sober, going to rehab, and then getting divorced, confronting infidelity. What's my relationship with sex and love? Then my father got diagnosed with cancer. Then I really lost my job with National Geographic. And then I went through a profoundly difficult relationship that I would say was sort of the final straw, because I was and the way I understand it now, this is, again, it's all storytelling, and that's what we do to understand ourselves. But the way I understand it, I was busy buoying myself to everything outside of myself. And once all of those things fell away, and the last one being external love, there was really nothing else for me to do. I felt so completely lost. And, I wasn't a climber. I wasn't a photographer. I hadn't published a book, so I couldn't call myself a writer. The primary understanding of masculinity in my life was dying. And now that source of like external value, as we so often seek it in partnership, was gone. And that all happened around the time that I was 40. And I guess 41 to 42. And so that was, I really would say that it wasn't until, gosh, even much more recently. That's why I'm so cautious about this shit, because it just keeps going, right? The journey just keeps spinning.
Hopefully
right?
it keeps going. Yeah.
It keeps going, and then just recently, well, my dad finally passed away, and people, and it's like, oh, I had no idea, as much as I didn't want him to go, how needed that was, that psychic load of always worrying about a loved one dying. I had another beautiful relationship after that one, and really was like, oh, I've really changed in relationship, but it wasn't right. Letting that go, the fires, all of it just keeps thrusting you along. And then all of a sudden you realize, and part of this is, a big piece of this conversation is about integrity. Part of it is I started to be able to identify what my values really are.
Mhm.
And then by virtue of that, I could see my behaviors as either in alignment or out of alignment with those values. And thus I was either in alignment with my integrity or out of alignment with myself. And orienting all of my actions around those things, then it's like you're going from here, like you're hunched over and there's the weight of the world. My dad's dying and this relationship doesn't work and all. And you start to step into those values and that integrity, and it's like your whole body just opens up.
Mhm.
And you're capable of just taking on more and standing stronger and inviting deep, meaningful, passionate love, both in romance and friendships, into your life, and so that was a very long answer. It was not one thing. It was a it was a truckload of things
Right.
that have landed me here.
But the avalanche maybe was a little bit of a holy crap wake
The,
up call
yeah.
moment.
In hindsight, yes. In the moment,
Mhm.
not so much,
Mhm.
right? It was like it thrust it all forward. And then it was years of going, oh shit, look at how much that stirred up in me.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know what I mean? But yes, that was the point.
Yeah.
And then the irony is you go back and you keep trying to do the same fucking thing over and over and over and over again.
Well, and anyone who's looked at their childhood and look back at their history, we see patterns of survival mechanisms that we chose, that we needed, that worked
Mm-hmm.
for a while, or being a competitive athlete and being super hardcore, or like being uber competitive. Like there's things that served us for a while.
Yeah.
And they were there for a reason, actually, to protect us and to help us. But those scripts don't last a lifetime. I think that's where people get stuck. If they choose the same mechanism of survival then they don't end up thriving. They really just sort of are surviving.
Well, but see, I think that's the big difference. You just pointed out something so beautiful. And this is back to these ideas of resilience. Survival and resilience are two very different things,
Mhm.
right? And adaptation for survival is immediate and reactive because we're
Yeah.
programmed to survive. It is not necessarily forward focusing outside of the immediate. And oftentimes what I've noticed is I've been in a survival mode and people go, oh, that's so resilient. But I'm like, well, if you really look at my life, I would say that resilience is it is not a reaction. It's a thoughtful response that leads to the most generative outcome from a challenging circumstance.
Mhm.
Whereas survival is, how do I adapt to this now so I don't die?
Right.
Right? There's space for both, but they're very different things.
Yeah.
So if I look back on my life, I'm like, well, I was very good at adaptation. And I was very good at endurance, meaning emotional endurance and tolerance. But the adaptations weren't always the most generative. They had positive impacts. They went, they got me things.
Right.
But to your point, those survival mechanisms themselves were just that. They were survival mechanisms.
Right.
They weren't resilience mechanisms.
Yeah, I love that distinction because yeah, and especially it's a great sports analogy as well,
Yeah.
where there's moments climbing or whatever where you just need to get to the top or get to the bottom.
Right.
And you don't really think about if there's any food left or anything else. You were just reacting versus planning, and there is both in high risk sport, but it's a great template for life skills.
Well, I mean, I don't think here's sort of the nugget that I speak about, and it's trademarked. No, but resilience is not about holding on; it's about letting go.
Yeah.
And this is what people oftentimes miss. We think of like this white knuckle grip. I oftentimes use the story of, and it's not one of mine, but I could easily find one of mine or many of mine, but it's so poignant in mountaineering where Joe Simpson and Simon Yates were climbing Sula Grande. It's the book Touching the Void. And if you look at this as a roadmap of resilience, it's actually really cool because it mirrors everything that I like to talk about, which is the rope is cut. He falls into a crevasse. He breaks his leg. He's looking, he's looking up at this window and like, how can I get out of this? How do I climb up out of this thing? And it's full just reactionary. I'm going to try. When he takes full agency of the situation, how, why, what happened, how he got there is completely of no consequence. And there's total agency. Then there's this moment of endurance that, like, how much can I take on here? And then with that endurance, there's the invitation into curiosity and knowing that you can't go back out the way you came. You can't do it. You are forced into, well, the last thing I want to do is go into this bottomless, icy, black pit below me. But it's where the curiosity is, right? Because I know I can't do that one. So what else can I do? He goes deeper in, like knowing, well, shit, I might rappel off the end of my rope here. And what happens? He finds the bottom and he finds a completely different way out of this thing. That could be used as a very specific roadmap for resilience because it's agency, it's endurance, it's curiosity, and it's adaptation. And those are those four pillars of resilience that I really talk about. And I just think that's a beautiful way to describe it.
Incredible bravery to go into the darkness.
You've got to go into the darkness, and you have to let go of your certainty of everything. And that is, that's part of the letting go process of resilience. You have to let go of why it happened. You have to let go of the comfort of what was. You have to let go of the certainty of, or the idea that you can do it again. And that allows you into curiosity, which then allows you into a space of adaptation where you're letting go of remaking something. And instead you're stepping into making something new.
I mean, in theory, like my hands just started sweating while you were telling the story. And I've read the book and like thinking of him going through this decision and then going into the darkness. My hands started sweating and like I've had a physical reaction of fear of like, no, I wouldn't want to go there. I don't want to go there. And I'm thinking of places in my own things where I didn't want to go into the darkness. And so how do you, I mean, how do you go?
How do you go into the darkness?
Yeah. Like if you don't want to go, you intellectually can say, well, I have no choice, and we know that, crisis will breed growth. But when you're in it, Like, how do you make that choice to go deeper down when you already feel you're down?
I was talking with a friend the other day, and she's just heartbroken. She's completely gutted. Um, and she was just saying, I can't do this. This isn't the life I wanted. I can't. And I sort of made the analogy. I'm like, you are in the crawl space, face down in the dirt, in the crawl space of the basement of the basement. And the only way to get out of the basement is to dig a hole.
Mm,
and so I think for me, what I've realized is when there's a resistance, when I feel that I don't want to, I can't. My friend Colin O'Brady talks about making your I can'ts into I can. And from there, you make it into I will. And then you make it into I have. But it's like, it's when you're facing the resistance, and this is back to the agency thing, you have to go, I really don't want to do this, which probably means I fucking should.
mhm,
Because it's that survival in us. It's like, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And it's like, yeah, but that's actually where all the meat is. So when I'm in those situations, what I try to do is notice my resistance.
mhm,
What am I scared of? What do I not like even thinking? Because if I don't like thinking something, that's worthy of looking at.
mhm.
What's happening to my nervous system when I imagine, changing tack here? Oh, I don't want to do that. I'm gonna. That's the first hint towards, this is probably actually the direction I need to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about, because none of us can do this alone. Those kind of, yeah, you're like, yeah, I hear that, but it makes me think
Right.
of the community that you've been building around yourself, uh,
Mm-hmm.
with the men's group and people that, the woman that you're talking about who came to you and was able to kind of say, I can't do this, and you were there
Mm-hmm.
to listen. Can you talk about the community that you've built, this
Mm.
support network, and sort of how that's helping you?
Sorry, that made me really emotional. I can talk for weeks about my community.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you haven't always had this community, right? And it's
no,
very intentional.
it's incredibly intentional, and it's something that I think you can probably relate to in some ways. But you brought up another piece of this, is that survival is all self-focused and
Yeah.
resilience is community-focused. And the way that we understand the directions we need to go is an honest reflection from those we trust. Um, my community here, I was in the sports community, the outdoor community for so long, and I made some very good friends there, and some of them I still have, but most of them I don't. And it's not because they're bad people, and it's not because um, I don't like them. It's because our bond was created around a shared activity. And if we had aligned values, that was great. But this community that I have now, specifically my men and the women in my life, it's all crafted around shared values. We don't have to do the same thing. That makes for a boring dinner conversation, quite frankly. I want to know, like what we share in our values, and how our integrity aligns around the many, many, many different things that we're doing. And by virtue of that, I learn and I grow more. And I noticed that when I stopped climbing, when I stopped shooting, most of those people just disappeared.
Mm,
And partly that was me. I didn't feel like I had anything to talk about with them anymore.
mhm,
Um, so when I moved to LA, I talk about Kenny every single time I do a podcast. He's the guy that I do a lot of my men's work with. I met a guy named Kenny Kane who owns the gym I go to. Just a great. He's a former stand-up comedian. He's he was a teacher. He's been a lifelong athlete. Like, the many hats of Kenny Kane. But it was through him And yes, it was through the gym, but it wasn't about the gym that I started to be invited into a collection of people that where we were learning to clearly articulate the things that moved us, not the actions that we did to be moved. And it was there that I started to really understand that purpose is not about an action. Purpose is something so much deeper than that. Purpose is not, you ask, well, what's your purpose? And people are like, I'm a storyteller.
Mhm.
That is the action of the purpose. The purpose would be, I'm here to connect people, or, something much, or I'm here to activate people, or I'm here to whatever it happens to be, or I'm here to care for my family, right? Like that's also a beautiful purpose. I am here to love and be a safe space for love. Everything that you do to create that's an action, that's an extension of purpose. And so with Kenny, I was able to start really understanding what my purpose is, which, by the way, can shift. And in doing so, that opened up my world to people that have now completely changed it, because I'm just surrounded by an entirely different kind of person.
Can you share your purpose with us?
Sure. Right now, my purpose is to connect people to themselves.
Mm.
That's what my purpose is right now. And that can change. But right now, the greatest gift I can give is by, through example and through offering my own experiences, inviting other people into deeper intimacy with themselves, and by virtue of that, those that they love.
I mean, it's how we started the conversation with your book that is dog-eared and has highlighter in it. And I've gone back to it multiple times. And, you sent me an early copy and I was like, oh, cool, and I was intrigued because I know you, but I did not expect to see so much of myself in it. Or, and it reads like this. It's so well written. It's like it almost feels like a dream. If anyone's done any dream therapy or dream writing about your dreams, it's such this cool flowy like way that memories come back to you, and so it's a really fun story, but it also was a very amazing reflection.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
so you are achieving that purpose. I I mean, I resonated with a ton of things in it. I really resonated with your relationship with your parents, and especially your father and your mother, and sort of acknowledging, the gifts they gave you, but also, they did the best they could in an
Yeah.
imperfect parent way. And my mom just passed away 3 months ago, and
Mm,
the words that you said to your dad in the airport, you just felt compelled to go running after him and say to him, "You were a good dad."
yeah.
And I I love that you did that and you acted on that response, and it brings tears to my eyes because I wish I had said that to my mom.
Yeah. You know, sorry, I'm crying because dad, my dad, he hated the word past. And he always joked about his sell by date. So my dad's sell by date came about 3 weeks ago, and
Mm,
we were all there, and it was so beautiful. And I just, it's so easy to get caught up in the bullshit of who did what.
mhm,
Um, and as people read into the book, they'll see that, I have a complicated relationship with my brother. I had a complicated relationship with my dad, and this isn't just an extension of grief. This is a place that I've come to before this, but I look at those relationships now and all of the pain that we went through. And for so long I looked at it and I was like, well, this happened to me, and now I look at it and I'm like, oh my God, I am so fucking grateful
mm,
for all of those complications, because they're just human, but B, they're my greatest guides.
Mm.
Had I not had those complications with my brother, with my parents, I wouldn't be who I am.
Yeah.
And it's this it just flips the world on its head, and it's this deep sense of gratitude, and it's like my mind just blows up, and I'm like, thank you. Like, thank you for everything, because I can look at it that way, and I can feel such a deep sense of peace and calm and curiosity and love for them and compassion. Or I can look at it like, all this shit happened to me. And just from my own experience, one, it's so much more beautiful. It just fills your heart with joy to think of the hard things and the hard situations and the hard relationships as these huge offerings.
Yeah.
And invitations into the totality of life, and they're just gifts that we get to unwrap and do with what we can. And God, I'm just so sorry, I just lost my shit for a minute.
No, I
I'm
mean,
just so
we can't.
grateful.
And I'm grateful to my mom. I wrote her a poem yesterday, kind of
Aw.
expressing some that she'll never read, and it was expressing a bit of remorse of not being able to say the things that you have been able to articulate with your family and your parents, and looking at those challenges now as gifts, and going darker into that cave, going deeper down
Yeah.
into the crevasse. In that moment, it doesn't seem like a gift for sure, but you
No.
are still here and able to articulate that, which, yeah, is a gift to them, but to the rest of us. I mean, what a special relationship. And did they read the book? I'm sure they did.
They did. Mom read it twice.
Yeah.
She was horrified. My brother hasn't read it, and he might never, and that's okay. But
Okay.
you know, my mom read it, and it was so funny because she was so scared of it, and then all of her friends started to read it, and I think she was very scared of being judged.
Mm.
And instead, what people started reaching out with was, I never knew. Like, I never knew you were caring so much. And I think, no, there was no judgment. That's the thing. You read these things, and you never read a memoir and really judge people. You might judge a character in them, but
I
really not
saw
often.
your parents' strength and
Yeah.
courage, and they didn't know how to navigate this. And I mean, I guess I was judging them, but in a very positive way, to be navigating this challenging situation, and to give you the tools of the outdoors, and then to eventually say, Cory, what do you need? We don't know what
We
to
don't
do.
know.
So
We don't
what
know what to do.
you do, and then you started making some of your own choices, which might have been a pretty pivotal really conversation to have with them.
I think it's, parent, and I'm not a parent yet. I think, and I didn't want to be for a long time, and now I'm really clear that I do want to be. I think people have kids for different reasons, and some of it's just biological and cultural. Like, oh yeah, I want to have kids. Like that, I just want to do that thing. The way I've come to it is, I understand, and maybe this is a little too esoteric for some people, maybe a little woo-woo, but I understand that a child is an autonomous soul. And the gift of parenting is not to remake your own in any way, but to invite another soul into this experience.
Yeah.
And the charge of that is to guard them and help them as best you can, to the point where then they get to go do it entirely on their own. And that is like, from a sort of cosmic level, from the high level, it's like being the portal to life. And I have no biological urge to make a child.
Yeah.
I have a deep desire to invite another soul into this experience because it's really, really marvelous. And it's just so fucking special. I'm laughing. I always do this where I start crying, and I'm laugh crying because I'm just sort of blown away by like how amazing it is to be alive.
Right.
And not like, oh, life is so good. It's just amazing to be living.
It is a gift to be here, and all the challenges of our world and everything that seems so messed up right now. And it is a gift to wake up and see the sunrise and go out and smell the air, and you know, um,
It's a gift to be a part of a messy world.
yeah, yeah,
And it doesn't mean the mess isn't there, and it doesn't mean that things aren't fucking horrible at places and times. It doesn't mean any of that, but that's part of existence. And I don't believe that, for me, the point is not to escape pain. It's to, pain is part of this. That's if we didn't have pain, we wouldn't really know joy. That's part of the
that's right.
polarity of things.
That's right.
It's
It is a
it's
teacher.
learning how to navigate it and then take it on so that then you can help other people navigate it, but not to escape it. I don't like that idea of escaping pain. Fuck, what would my life be without some of the pain I've gone through, without all of it?
I think that is such a beautiful message in your book, as you didn't hide from any of it. You did, for part of your life, you were hiding or trying to figure it out, and then you really did expose everything with the goal of, and I sense this, the goal of not being an expert or not even telling your story, but to expose a story so other people could feel maybe a little less alone in their story and a little more understood. And it's a beautiful book. It's a gift to us. um I do want to ask you, since this is called What's the Rush, and we're
Yeah.
stripping away, what's left? What are you working on right now of slowing down or removing
Mm,
in your life?
you know, what I'm working on right now is understanding how I can best be of service and what that looks like. That's my primary concern right now. But I'm also really focusing on further developing like the clarity around love and relationship and family, and what I want that to look like in my life, and how I can best, I don't want to say execute it, but what that looks like. And so I'm in a moment of extreme activation and uptick and upswing, and things are very much falling into place. And part of that is also learning just to trust
Mm.
rather than thrust, meaning thrust myself upon something. Trust, and lean into my intuition, lean into my knowing, lean into my values, and allow things to happen by letting go, and letting go of stories, letting go of all of it, and actually honestly moving towards a place of generative, thoughtful resilience instead of reactivity.
It's definitely our first half of our lives, a different skill set in this sort of the outdoor action sports world.
Yeah, right.
Career. It's definitely a flip, and I'm right there with you. I'm on that same journey with you. So I really appreciate the time
Thank
today.
you. I feel like we could do 5 more. So
Well, we will,
great.
but we'll probably wrap for today. So many good nuggets from you, and everyone. The book is the color of everything. It really is quite stunning. Cory, we'll put all your info in the show notes and things, but mostly, thank you for expanding sort of my growth and thought process in this conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I would also say, your mom hasn't read the paper, but she knows the poem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, it's a long and dusty road and a hot and heavy load. Folks I meet ain't always kind. Some are bad, some are good, some have done the best they could. Some have tried to ease my troubling mind. And I can't help but wonder where I'm bound, where I'm bound. Can't help but wonder where I'm bound.